Hello po sa inyong lahat, to those who are watching live, those who are here in the US, those who are in the Philippines po. Magandang, what time is it there, Ma'am Andre, in the Philippines?
It's 12:07.
Tanghali. Yeah,
Tanghali po.
it's almost midnight here also in Washington DC. Yeah, alas 11
Ah,
po ng gabi.
Good evening, Sir Alan.
Hello po sa inyong lahat. Those who are watching live po, and those I'm sure many teachers, because many of our teachers are at work right now. They're in the Philippines, or probably doing some work. They will be watching this playback later on. Magandang araw po sa inyong lahat. Those who will watch this as a playback, magandang araw din po sa inyong lahat. Hello po. We have a very special guest, di ba, Ma'am Andre? Ma'am Andre, our program managing director po. Kumusta po kayo dyan sa Iloilo?
Masaya ako at excited ako sa lecture ng aking uh, former professor ng college sa University of the Philippines in the Visayas. Kasi idol ko siya kasi history major ako, history professor ko siya nung first year college. So it's happy ako. Mga kakultura, magandang hapon, magandang tanghali, magandang gabi at magandang araw, makulturang araw, mga kapwa ko ka-eskwela ngayong araw dito sa buong universe. Masaya ako sa pagbabahagi ng isang taong malapit sa puso ko. Siya ay Professor of History at Western Illinois University. She receives her Ph.D. in History from the University of Alberta in Canada, MA in International Relations from the International University of Japan in Niigata, Japan, and BA in History cum laude from the University of the Philippines, Visayas. At Western, she offers the History Department's survey courses, upper division courses, and graduate seminars on the history of Asia. She was the recipient of the 2016 Provost Award of Excellence in Multicultural Teaching. Our guest research interest includes gender and feminism and imperial medicine and public health. She has published articles in several journals, including the Pacific Historical Review in U.S. Japan Women's Journal. She served as associate editor and co-author of the Filipino Women and American Empire in Women and Modern Empires, WAMI 1840 to the Present, Alexander Street Press 2017. Co-editor of Kathryn Kish-Sklar and Thomas Dublin. Our guest's current book project is a social history of Culion leprosarium 1900s to 1930s. She has received including the National Endowment for the Humanities NEH Fellowship and the NEH Summer Stipend for her project in Culion. Mga kakultura, mga kapwa ko ka-eskwela, let us welcome to KULECTERATURA my former professor Febe or Dr. Febe Pamonag. Makulturang araw, Ma'am Febs. Thank you so
Hi.
much.
Hello.
Hello. Hello.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Andre, for that kind introduction. Andre was a student in one of the classes that I taught at the University of the Philippines, Visayas in Miagao. And now, teacher na rin si Andre. So I'm so proud of her. Congratulations, Andre.
I'm sure we have a lot to learn from you po, Ma'am Phoebe. Yes.
And I'm excited to learn from you as well. This is really a nice venue to just share ideas, right, and thoughts about some of the broader issues that are illuminated in my study, and I'll talk about them. So, but first, bago ako mag-umpisa, I just would like to say, thank you very much to Alan, to Anita, Riverboy Studios, and again to Andre for inviting me to, to share my work with all of you today. And maayong udto um, sa mga taga Iloilo and other parts of the Philippines. And good morning, good evening, perhaps to those who are watching in other parts of the Asia Pacific region. Thank you for spending a part of your weekend with us. And last but not the least, good evening to those who are watching from the US. I know it's late here in Illinois. It is past 10, and in Alan's case, like past 11. So, and it's Friday night. So thank you for joining us this late. Okay, so I'd like to start by sharing with you the story of a university in Japan. So, Alan, please, the next slide. If you can turn to the next slide, please. Okay, and so in October 2021, last year, Tsuda University, a private women's university in Tokyo, Japan, hosted a panel discussion to commemorate the 120th anniversary of the university. Japanese education reformer Tsuda Umeko, pictured here, established the Joshi Eigaku Juko, or English Institute for Women. Next slide, please. In short, JAJ, in 1900. The JAJ was one of the first institutions of higher education for women in Japan. It was renamed Tsuda College in 1948 and Tsuda University in 2017. Next slide, please. Okay, so Tsuda University, 2017. The panel discussion held in October last year highlighted a special connection between Tsuda University and in Tokyo, Japan, and another university, actually a women's college in Pennsylvania in the US. Next slide, please. And I'm referring, next slide, yes, there, Bryn Mawr College in Pennsylvania. And a few years ago, my research project examined Transpacific initiatives for Japanese women's higher education during the early 20th century, with particular emphasis on Bryn Mawr, as you can see here, and Tsuda College. Thus, the press release about the panel discussion in October last year reminded me of my project. And when I received Andre's invitation to speak with you today, I chose Transpacific initiatives for Japanese women's higher education as my topic because it aligns with what we are celebrating this month, Women's History Month. We are celebrating women's achievements and the actions they took for equality, while we also try to raise awareness about biases. This presentation is based on my project on Tsuda and Bryn Mawr and the article that was published in the Pacific Historical Review. My study of Bryn Mawr and Tsuda illustrates the kinds of histories that emerge when relations are formed by women and linkages are drawn that transcend traditional or national borders. So first, I will discuss Tsuda's strategies as she appealed for support from Bryn Mawr students and graduates, and then I will discuss Bryn Mawr College's response to Tsuda's solicitations. Bryn Mawr College was established in 1885. It is one of the 7 historically women's colleges in the US. Bryn Mawr is also Tsuda's alma mater, and I'm going to expound on this point later. Published works on Tsuda and Bryn Mawr highlight Bryn Mawr Dean M. Carey Thomas's, next slide please, and Bryn Mawr's contributions, such as helping Tsuda to network with American women, and providing her with academic training that informed her educational reforms in Japan. So this is an image of Bryn Mawr Dean M. Curry Thomas. Other scholars have gone beyond documenting the background and contributions of American women. For example, Tsuda specialist Kameda Kinoko considered the reciprocal impact of Tsuda and Bryn Mawr as they facilitated a mutual exchange of cultures between the US and Japan during the first half of the 20th century. Yet, when I undertook this project a few years ago, Tsuda's direct appeals to Bryn Mawr friends and classmates, her broader requests through Bryn Mawr publications, and her supporters' rationales for responding was largely unexplored. So I went to Japan, to Tsuda College, I went to Bryn Mawr, and examined numerous documents, including personal correspondence like letters, committee reports, published sources, including college newsletters and other school publications and newspaper accounts. Based on my research, I argue that Tsuda anchored her multi-layered argument for why Bryn Mawr should support JEJ, her school in Tokyo, on the idea that higher education was an instrument for self-improvement. Such an idea appealed to the feminist aspirations of Bryn Mawr and resonated with faculty, students, and graduates, and with their dean, Thomas, because they sought to validate the importance of higher learning for women and to spread, quote, the best ideals of Bryn Mawr outside the United States. This study contributes to the existing scholarship on Suda by discussing her activities in a trans-Pacific context. It builds on and contributes to the literature on transnationalism in Japan. For example, feminist historian Mire Koikare focused on the American occupation of Japan after the end of World War II, and her work demonstrates how reformist projects by Americans, especially by American women, for Japanese women, were often reflected and sustained hierarchies based on race and nation. My article on Bryn Mawr and Tsuda during the early 20th century illustrates how notions of differences between women and nation emerged on both sides of the Pacific, in other words, from both the US and Japan. Additionally, exploring Tsuda's and her Bryn Mawr supporter solicitations for the benefit of the JEJ in Tokyo illuminates how their arguments intertwined with identity formation and negotiation. Now, let's take a look at Tsuda Umeko. Next slide, please. Let's get to know her a little bit. So Tsuda was a Japanese government scholar, the youngest of the five girls. So you can see the picture on the right side of the screen, five girls in their kimono from samurai families who left Tokyo in December 1871 to study in the United States. So I mentioned samurai families. I'm sure many of you have know about the samurai families, the samurai as a class. So before 1868 in Japan, the samurai was on top of Japan's social hierarchy, and these five girls were from samurai families. The Meiji government, that's the name of the government that was established in Japan in 1868, supported the education of these five girls. So the government paid for their tuition fees, for their allowances, everything. And also the education of girls in Japan. So promoting the education, for example, education of girls at the elementary level, 6 years. And the education of women also in Japan, based on the belief that educated womanhood would facilitate Japan's success as a modern nation. So for context here, let me highlight two important points. One, before 1868, the girls in Japan, especially the daughters of, samurai daughters or daughters of samurai families, if, some of them, they got education from their mothers or from the schools that were established by their families, but in general, among the samurai families, the elite families, the education of boys or sons was privileged over the education of daughters, of girls. And so that's one context. That's why what happened after 68, was a completely different from the pre-1868 Japan. Another important information here in terms of context is that the previous government before 1868, under the Tokugawa shogun or great general, imposed a national isolation policy from the 1630s to the early 1850s. But the US government used what historians call gunboat diplomacy. Next slide, please. In 1853 to open up Japan. So here is a Japanese artist rendition of, you know, American Commodore Matthew Perry's steam-powered block ships near Edo, which is modern Tokyo. So Edo is the old name of Tokyo. It was renamed Tokyo in 1868. And so the American Commodore Matthew Perry actually brought Japan's 2-century-old self-imposed isolation policy to a close. And after this, because Japan did not have the military ability to protect itself from the US, after a lot of debates, from the shogunal level, consulting the domain lords at the local level, Japan decided to open up a number of its ports, first to Americans. Some coaling ports were established, and then later on to American merchants, and then American missionaries. Speaking of American missionaries were allowed to Japan at a time when the Tokugawa government still had its official ban on the propagation of Christianity in the country. And for these reasons, the treaty between the US and Japan that was engendered by Perry's gunboat diplomacy in 1853 was referred to by the Japanese as an unequal treaty. So a humiliating experience for the Japanese government and for the people in general. European countries followed the United States and imposed or exacted the same, their own version of unequal treaties with Japan. Thus, the Meiji government that was established in 1868 after the collapse of the Tokugawa Bakufu or shogunate sought to rectify or get rid of those unequal treaties and make Japan strong in both economic and military terms. So for teachers here, those who teach the history of East Asia, especially China, so this was 1853. The people in Japan, government officials, they knew about what happened in China, 1839 to 42, the first Opium War between China and Britain. China lost, right? It wasn't able to compete or defend itself against this mighty British Navy. So, Japan learned from that, learned its lesson from that. And so it opened up the country, accepted unequal treaties, and those unequal treaties were one of the drivers for Japan's modernization after 1868. So in 1871, just 3 years after the establishment of the Meiji government, the Iwakura mission, next slide please, which consisted of government officials and students. So the Japanese government sent the Iwakura mission to the US and Europe for the purpose of studying economic, political, social, and military infrastructures. And they wanted to learn from the West. Tsuda and the other 4 girls pictured here were part of the Iwakura mission. So as you can see here on the left side, when they left Japan, they were still in their traditional Japanese garb, the kimono. And then here on the right side is Tsuda in her American attire, in her American dress. Tsuda lived in Georgetown, northwest of Washington, D.C. So Alan, right? So the East Coast, Alan is in the East Coast right now, Washington, D.C. Yeah, so Tsuda lived in Georgetown with Japanese legation secretary Charles Landman and his wife Adeline. The Landmans were devout Episcopalians, and Tsuda was baptized in an Episcopal church in 1873, soon after the Japanese government lifted its ban on the propagation of Christianity in Japan. Tsuda returned to Tokyo in 1882 after graduating from high school at Archer's Institute in Georgetown. However, having lived in the US for more than a decade, Tsuda had difficulty speaking Japanese and was frustrated during the early years of her return to Tokyo. So let me share with you a few lines from one of the letters that Tsuda wrote to her American foster mother, Adeline, after, like a few months after she returned to Tokyo. So this is Tsuda in her own words. But I must learn, though as yet I have made no progress and cannot follow a conversation, satisfying myself if I can catch a word or two here and there. I have not yet learned to bow politely, and in fact, cannot in my foreign dress. I feel truly very awkward, and I'm thankful though that I came home when I did, and so I'm yet young and able to learn more readily. So here is Tsuda frustrated not just with her inability to speak fluently, right, with the members of her family and other friends in Tokyo, but also unable to do all those Japanese conventions like bowing. But then she was also hopeful, right, that she would be able to do all those things in due time. In another letter that Tsuda sent to Adeline, she described herself as somebody, quote, in a peculiar situation. Her, quote, ways of thinking are very difficult from Japanese, very different from foreigners here, Tsuda wrote. She criticized Japanese conventions, including the expectations by mothers to their daughters, and also in home economics classes in Japan after 1868, because they believe that sewing will make a girl or a young woman a good wife material. And so in addition, some American missionaries who had built schools for Japanese girls and boys in Japan, like Tokyo and other places, also received Tsuda's criticisms, which can be interpreted as part of her effort to define her identity as Japanese. For example, Tsuda complained about underfunded mission schools and missionaries who were out of touch in Japan. Tsuda emphasized that only, quote, natives like her could connect with and truly understand the Japanese people. Despite Tsuda's brief residence in Japan and limited contact with Japanese women outside of friends and family in Tokyo, Tsuda claimed that she could do the work necessary for the women in Japan. Still, she was conscious of her privileged and ambiguous position in Japanese society. She considered herself, quote, above them and yet truly one of them. Tsuda worked as an English language teacher in Tokyo, and in 1885 she accepted a permanent position at a government school for the daughters of elite families. In 1889, she took a 2-year study leave, went to the US, and enrolled as a special student at Bryn Mawr College, where she met Bryn Mawr College Dean M. Carey Thomas. Next slide, please. During breaks from Bryn Mawr, Tsuda raised funds for her project, education. So this is, by the way, Tsuda at Bryn Mawr. So during breaks from Bryn Mawr, Suda raised funds for her first education project, a scholarship that would provide select Japanese women with college education in the US. And I discussed the scholarship in another article on Suda that I published in another journal. In September 1900, 9 years after the scholarship was launched in Philadelphia, Tsuda established the Joshi Eigaku Juko in Tokyo. So that was her second educational project for women. The JAJ was one of the three women's colleges founded in Japan at the turn of the 20th century to provide Japanese women with post-secondary education. Unlike public universities, which were exclusively for men, these women's colleges did not have university status. Open to graduates of girls' high schools, the JAJ in Tokyo offered a 3-year program that focused on English language teaching. In 1905, so that's 5 years after it was established in Tokyo, the JAJ, so graduates from the JAJ receive a government license to teach English above the elementary grade. When Tsuda solicited donations from Bryn Mawr, she underscored her school's emphasis on English language instruction. But this was just one element of her multifaceted argument for why Bryn Mawr should support her school in Tokyo. So now I'm going to turn to Tsuda's solicitations for the JAJ. Tsuda sought the support of Bryn Mawr students and graduates by presenting a multi-layered argument anchored primarily on a feminist idea that women, not their husbands or families, were the direct beneficiaries of their education. In 1907, Tsuda published in the Bryn Mawr Quarterly an essay that declared her school's goal to empower Japanese women by training them so that they could think and act for themselves and take the initiative. Published as part of a campaign to raise $50,000 to build a dormitory and classrooms for Tsuda's school in Tokyo, this essay outlined the college's desperate need for funding. It presented the JAJ as instrumental in the liberation of its students from their subservient positions, claiming that majority were from conservative families and used to obedience under the guidance of a superior. We can best understand Tsuda's argument for women's higher education within the context of late 19th century gender norms in Japan and the education ministry's policy for women. Underlying Tsuda's argument for why Japanese women should be provided with the opportunity to pursue post-secondary education through the JAJ was her critique of the expectation for Japanese women to serve the needs of their families. The training of girls and women according to the good wife, wise mothers ideals was a major policy of both the education ministry and some private Japanese educators, especially at the turn of the 20th century. In contrast, the JAJ in Tokyo, its original curriculum did not include kasei gakko or domestic science. Instead, it professionalized teaching for women by preparing them for the Japanese government examination to obtain an English certificate, the document required to teach English above the elementary grade. The college's curriculum suggests that Tsuda saw English language teaching as a means for women to benefit directly from their education and be financially independent of their families. By emphasizing how women could benefit directly from their education, Tsuda defined a new identity for Japanese women that was similar to the argument forwarded by women's rights advocates during the 1870s, so from previous decades, most notably Kishida Toshiko, who argued that education should enable women to manage their own lives. Both Kishida and Tsuda sought to promote a new identity for women who were financially independent of their families. This was deemed important for Japanese women because a provision of the 1898 Meiji Civil Code conflated women's identity with that of their families. This provision placed women under the authority of the household, most often under a male family head, fathers or husbands. The Meiji Civil Code, another provision of this was it prohibited a wife from entering into a legal contract without her husband's permission and allowed husbands to divorce their wives at will. So, in addition to the idea of educating women for themselves, Tsuda's public appeal for support from Bryn Mawr rested on sisterhood, based partly on the notion that Japanese women were different from American women, especially in terms of opportunities to foment independent action. According to Tsuda, young women who entered women's colleges in Japan, such as the JJ in Tokyo, had limited opportunities to develop a sense of initiative and leadership since childhood. Tsuda thus portrayed Japanese women as a homogeneous group with similarly limited childhood experiences, and Japan as having a constricting gender system that offered fewer opportunities for individual growth relative to the US. Reinforcing the theme of difference between the American and Japanese gender systems, Tsuda alluded to the narrow old ethical code that held Japanese women back and suggested that obedience under the guidance of a superior was customary for Japanese women. It is interesting to note that Tsuda held Japanese women in lower esteem than American women, but in higher esteem than other Asian women. So this is very interesting. She did not offer explanations for why she held other Asian women in lower esteem than Japanese women. So she did not, so let me say this again. She did not offer explanations for why she held other Asian women in lower esteem than Japanese women. But Suda attributed Japanese women's inferior position relative to American women to their, quote, environment and lack of educational opportunities. Such an emphasis on the problems and issues that confronted Japanese women relative to their American counterparts was a strategic device to elicit American women's sympathy and galvanize them into action. But it had significant omissions with far more complex implications. For example, Tsuda's 1915 essay noted the lack of great women's movements in Japan and claimed there has been no discussion, agitation, and objection on matters she deemed important for women. Yet, Japanese women, for example, Imai Utako and Sakai Tameko, led a campaign as early as 1905 for the revision of Article 5 of the Security Police Law that banned women from joining political organizations and attending political meetings. Perhaps Tsuda excluded these women and their advocacies in her essay because she believed that it was not the right time to campaign for political rights and thus reinforced her claim that her school was needed to train Japanese women for independent thought and action. Tsuda's silence on these women and their advocacies helped sustain the idea that Japanese women lagged behind American women, especially in terms of social and political activism. The scholar Takahashi Yuko, current president of Tsuda University, found in her study of Tsuda that she attended meetings for women's suffrage in Japan. Again, for background information here, Japan got the right was able to vote for the first time and run for office only after the end of World War II. Although they have, they protested, they have advocated for women's suffrage, campaigned for women's suffrage, decades before the 1940s. So Tsuda's notion of sisterhood also hinged on the seemingly contradictory idea of Japanese women having similar attributes and aspirations as American women. Tsuda strengthened her argument for why Bryn Mawr women, for why Bryn Mawr should support her school by highlighting gender-based commonalities among Japanese and American women. Both had common goals and were confronted with similar challenges as they struggled to pursue higher education for themselves. So Andre here is giving me the reminder 10 minutes before lecture ends. Okay, so let me just choose some other important points here under Tsuda. Um, in my research, I found that Tsuda's arguments could be linked to her sense of identity. For example, her argument on behalf of the JEJ embodied her negotiation of her transnational identities. American and Japanese interests in Asia clashed at the turn of the 20th century, and anti Japanese agitation driven by Japanese immigration on the West Coast gained political strength during the century's first decade. So, against this backdrop, Tsuda negotiated and capitalized on her in betweenness, to paraphrase historian Ichiro Azuma's words, by presenting her school as a bridge between Japan and the US. Okay, now let me turn to Bryn Mawr College response to Tsuda. Members of the Bryn Mawr community responded to Tsuda's exhortations for assistance in various ways by publishing essays and delivering speeches, asking other graduates and students to raise funds for Tsuda's school by contributing money, by donating books and other school supplies. Their personal letters and published appeals warrant particular attention because they illuminate their personal motivations and display a publicly articulated enthusiasm for Bryn Mawr's support of the Joshi Eigaku Juko. Personal correspondence between Tsuda and her Bryn Mawr friends and classmates suggests that a belief in Japanese women's lack of opportunities for educational advancement, as well as shared interest in women's higher education, drove the latter's commitment to Tsuda's school. And I saw this in the letters written by Tsuda's classmates and other students and graduates from Bryn Mawr. And um, other solicitations from Bryn Mawr highlighted a sense of sisterhood that was based on the idea of difference that Japanese women were, they lagged behind their American counterparts. For example, one essay that was published in the Bryn Mawr Quarterly was titled A Bryn Mawr School in the East. So, just like Tsuda, her Bryn Mawr supporters presented the JAJ as an extension of Bryn Mawr. And like Tsuda, her Bryn Mawr supporters also invoked sisterhood to argue for the uplift of Japanese women. And yet, as I mentioned, unlike Tsuda's notion of sisterhood, which hinged on both Japanese women's difference in terms of opportunities and commonality in terms of attributes and aspirations with American women, that of her Bryn Mawr supporters tended to highlight cultural and material differences, not commonalities, and thereby reinforce the view that Japan and Japanese women lagged behind the US and American women. And when I looked at Bryn Mawr graduates who undertook educational projects for women in Asia, like China and India, they were driven by a genuine desire to help, but they also assumed a sense of benevolent superiority based on contemporary assumptions of differences among races, nations, and women. Their accounts reveal assumptions about the superiority of Christian civilization, and their efforts for social reforms often intertwined with their desire to spread Christianity. So these American and European women tended to present themselves as feminist agents endowed with progressive and modern ideology and practice. Such reformist perspectives are better understood when placed within the context of the rise of the United States as an imperial power in the Asia Pacific region at the turn of the 20th century. Existing scholarship on empire has shown that in this context, white Americans came to internalize a rigidly defined racial cultural hierarchy. Ideas of, quote, uplifting and enlightening Asian women implicitly and explicitly figured in Bryn Mawr graduates' justification for their educational endeavors in Asia, just as such notions were present in President William McKinley's rationale for colonizing the Philippines and in American media that justified the annexation of the Philippines. So, how significant were Bryn Mawr's contributions to Tsuda schools? It is difficult to ascertain from available sources the college's total monetary contributions to the JAJ, but they provided funds for teacher salaries, for scholarships, for the salary of an American teacher who taught at JAJ. They raised funds, thousands of dollars. And yeah, so I have all this information about their financial contributions. But beyond that, durable relationships were also forged between the two schools throughout the years. Strong ties between Tsuda School and Bryn Mawr continued well beyond the death of Tsuda in 1929. In 2000, Bryn Mawr held a year-long celebration of the centennial of Tsuda College. Next slide, please. That has, as the Bryn Mawr Alumni Bulletin describe it, maintained a close relationship with its Western sister through the exchange of students. And as I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, in October last year, Tsuda University, the last slide please, hosted a panel discussion that highlighted the connection between Tsuda University and Bryn Mawr College. In conclusion, this study illuminates the possibilities and limitations of the transnational educational partnership between Japan and the United States during the early 20th century, the first half of the 20th century, a time of, the early decades of that, a time of strained bilateral relations between the US and Japan. And then, of course, what happened during the Asia Pacific War. So in this presentation, we celebrate women's achievements, their efforts to provide opportunities for other women to pursue higher education, and especially those transnational networks of women. And so this, for teachers here, this is a different history that you see, different from the usual approach to the history of the early 20th century, especially if you approach it through diplomatic history or political or military history. Moreover, this study implicitly and explicitly shows nation-specific differences and cleavages, as well as the influence of contemporary nationalized and racial assumptions. It illuminates the paradoxes of a transnational endeavor that provided certain Japanese women with an opportunity to pursue higher education while simultaneously sustaining notions of differences among women and nations. Thank you very much. Yeah, so that's the end of my presentation. Thank you for watching. Thanks for listening.
Thank you po. Thank you. Wow, there's a very talagang tamang-tama for the International Women's Month. Ano po yung lesson po ninyo. Very inspiring because of course that's something that I think many countries share, is that women's suffrage. Even here in the U.S. actually, I think they share the same time when they're trying to get out of that, the inequality from here in the U.S. and even there in Japan after the World War II. And we have a couple of questions here, or not questions, but prompts for discussion po. What was the role of education in moving away from the inequality against women in the case of Tsuda po?
So education in Japan after 1868, as elsewhere and in other temporal contexts, played a very important role, especially as a vehicle for the advancement of women. Especially when I mentioned earlier yung context, yung historical context na prior to 1868, even among those who were considered as at the top of the social hierarchy in Japan, the samurai, right? the education of boys, of sons, was privileged over the education of daughters or girls. And this has to do
Yeah.
with this concept, cultural concept of filial piety, you know,
Yes. Mhm.
in Japan, in China, in East Asia, and
Mhm.
it's the same in many other countries, right? Even in the Philippines,
Yeah.
to some extent. Although I
Mhm.
see that more pronounced siya in East Asia, and
Mhm.
under that, yung filiality or filial piety, honoring your ancestors, right? So
Yes.
highly gendered siya because, according to the book, classic book on filiality in China, the greatest sort of, to use a word na sin, or yung the thing na hindi mo dapat gawin na talagang unfilial is not to have children.
Mhm. Mhm.
In other words, you need to have children,
You
and
need
not
to
just
have children.
any anong klaseng child. It has to be a son na who can
Yes.
carry the family
Very,
name, right?
because of
To
it's very
honor,
paternalistic ano po
right?
yung
So to
culture
honor the
natin.
ancestors, and that's why yung surname, dapat family
Mhm.
name. So when a woman enters, her husband's family, she's expected to change her family name. Yan yung norm. So kung tingnan natin sa ganyang konteksto, on that context, and makikita natin that education was really pivotal, instrumental for
Mhm.
the advancement of women. But then you probably noticed, I had to do like a slight class analysis. Now those were privileged women too, even those who entered
Yeah.
Suda College,
Yeah.
right?
Because too,
So
that's not a very normal. Yeah,
right,
she didn't grow up in a very normal living. Yeah.
right.
Yes.
And the same thing with those who entered women's colleges in the US, right?
Mhm.
But then it's like the baby steps, right? First steps. Yeah, so it's then yeah, at least there were those women, and later on they established their own schools. For example, in Japan, to the
Yeah, that's
graduate.
really,
So nagiging
yeah.
ano siya, right? Yung wider. You could see
Yes.
the effect, the wider impact of that.
I like what you said a while ago when you said women were the direct beneficiaries of their education. And that's exactly what had happened, with Tuda, that she was a direct beneficiary of her own education, and later on, kind of like leveraged on that, and um, shared that privilege with others. And I think
Right,
that's very important that she was able to kind of share that privilege, because others, she could have just like embraced that on her own, but no,
right.
she did not. She went ahead and shared that privilege
By
to other.
establishing her own school, di ba?
Yes, establishing her own school. So, really great stuff. And even this one, what you said for a while ago, education should enable women to manage their own lives. And these are
Yeah.
all great um, um, example of how education kind of played a role in the moving away from women's suffrage. Like the inequalities against women and all of this. Um, it, Education played a very vital role
And
in
continues to play a
and
pivotal, very
right.
important play in the lives of women in the 21st century, right? In
Hmm.
in various regions of the world,
Yeah,
um, as a
it
way
puts them
to,
in the same playing field. I think it puts them in the same playing field as men, you know, because right now women can take up different roles. I mean, in the society, uh, they're in the military, they're doctors, they are pilots, they are lawyers, who are women. These are roles before that woman does not. You don't see women taking these roles back then, but right now it's something that you can even see sometimes women dominating those roles.
so
Um,
yan nga, we celebrate those achievements, right?
yeah.
While I mentioned earlier, now while we also try to raise awareness about some yung mga elements of continuity in terms of mga
Hmm.
gender expectations and biases against women. And let me share with you here yung yung findings about, for example, sa Japan in 2018, may mga scandals. There were a number of scandals involving first Tokyo Medical School and other medical schools in Japan that manipulated the results of the admission examination against women who took the examination in
Wow.
favor of men because they wanted to reduce the number of women who entered the medical school. They wanted
Mhm.
more men to enter the
Men, yeah.
medical school. So we're talking about 2018, and that was one school. So this prestigious, Tokyo Medical School, and then several other schools were later discovered to have done the same thing. May mga lawsuits pa nga,
Mhm.
against them. So what's the broader issue here? So that kind of practice, they did it because and other scholars of women and gender in Japan have analyzed this because that's based on the assumption those school authorities were assuming that these women, they will just get married when after graduation, or if even if they'll practice right as a medical doctor, when they get pregnant they'll stop working, so it will be a loss of the profession. So those kinds of assumptions against women. So this is where we see those structural limitations and still those factors that hindered women right from pursuing right the what they wanted to do, or so these
Mhm.
structural limitations or inequalities against women. So that's still a reality for many women today, not just in
Yeah.
Japan, but you
Mhm.
have parallel cases in other countries. Also, another findings, many of the although there are there's a greater number of women in the US and in the Philippines who who enter the university, are college or university students and
Mhm.
graduates relative to men, right? But it's interesting, just like before, the fields that those women or their majors, right? So usually those are like the soft, defined as those soft disciplines or majors like the humanities,
Yeah.
literature, history is even, included there,
Mhm.
versus, those so-called hard sciences, right? Like
Mhm.
STEM, um, science, technology,
Engineering. Yeah.
mathematics, where
Yeah.
you find a larger percentage of male
Men, yeah.
students, or of men students or male students in those majors. So you can still see right yung gendering. You can still see that. Um, yeah. So those, but you're right that there are also positive developments, like many of the fields right that
Mhm.
used to be the domain of men,
Mhm.
right, are also we also see women entering those fields, and
Yeah.
also many schools, non-governmental organizations, even governments that promote women, right, like in the science, providing scholarships, right, and many other sort of and other things that will encourage women to have a place in those fields.
All
Yeah.
because of education, all because of education. Education gave women that kind of like leverage to
Um,
play in that same playing field as men. um
right.
another here that was mentioned, or actually let me ask that later on, because I've noticed a while ago, po, you mentioned when Suda went back to Japan and kind of like had this experience that, can we say that Suda had somehow experienced an identity crisis when she went back to Japan? Is this
Yeah.
comparable to a second generation migrant? For example, a second generation migrant would be their parents are the ones that migrated here in the Philippines, but they were born here already. This second generation migrant going back to the Philippines, right? And then
Mm,
now they only know how to speak English and
mm,
did not speak Tagalog in the Philippines. Is that comparable to how Chuda was going through when she went back to Japan?
so first, yung first question,
Mhm.
yes. In fact, yung letters, just a few letters that I shared with you, right? You can really see um, that she said she was in between. She was
Mm.
different from she was different from the Japanese, and yet she was also different from the foreigners in Japan. You know, and so the Japanese, um, especially 1880s, 1890s, when there was a backlash against Westernization in Japan. So those with Western education were sort of not necessarily viewed in a positive light, unlike in the early years, 1870s, when the government really promoted Westernization all out,
Mhm.
modernization that is Westernization. So, and because of that, Suda was like, so who, right? So she was like defining herself in her letters to Adeline. She was like, I am a native. I'm a Japanese woman with an education. That is why I must do what I need to do. I am the only one who can do this. American missionaries who are here in Japan, even if they have the money, they have schools, they're out of touch. They don't understand, the Japanese culture. And
Mhm.
right?
And
So,
it's good that she used her privilege. She kind
mm,
of used her privilege to again share
right.
back. She
Yeah.
used her privilege to give back to the community. And I think that's something that I really admire
Right.
about this story is that
Right.
though Isuda was privileged, she used that in a way
Right.
to give back to the community, and that's
Right.
something that's very admirable.
Yeah, I agree. So she used her position with
Mhm.
having one foot in Japan and another
Mhm.
foot in the US, right, to promote women's higher education. So she was able to solicit money from Bryn Mawr. She was able to solicit money from, for example, Quaker, these rich Quaker families in Philadelphia. And I have another article about that, right?
Mhm.
And many other, and women's colleges like Vassar, and other colleges here and her other supporters. So she was able to make use of those networks here, right? Because of more than a decade. She lived here for more than a decade. She studied in Bryn Mawr, right? And yet, she said, I must return to Japan because the government spent for her education, right?
Yeah, yeah, that's
So
really
she
great.
felt a responsibility, not just for the government, but especially for the women of Japan.
I want to highlight one comment here po, from G Suyo. Enlightening talk about the intersectionality between culture, race, and class, migration, gender equality, and development. Really great point that was pointed out here by one of our viewers. And here's another comment that she has. Education indeed is one of the best strategies for promoting women's empowerment and even in protecting women against different forms of gender-based violence. Unfortunately, even in the 21st century, which is, even during our time, not all nations have been able to close the gender gap in education. That is very true. There are still well, that's why there's that. I guess continue to there's still continue to fight for equality. Um,
Thank you very much. If I may say, thank you very much, G. G here is a
mhm.
family member and an instructor also at the University of the Philippines in Manila.
Wow,
Yeah. So
it's
thank you very
great.
much. And she's an expert on gender as well and has published
Wow,
economics development. Yeah. So thank you, G. Yeah.
nice, nice,
I,
nice.
I
That's
I
a
really
really great
I
comment.
really agree. Yung protecting women against different forms of gender-based violence. That's why, you may ask, are women's colleges or universities still relevant? For example, in the 21st century, that's why there are many who argue that those women's colleges and universities are needed because of those gender-based violence, providing women with, a safe place against sexual harassment and putting women at the center of learning and giving them opportunities to thrive and to be in a leadership position. That's why, yeah, many argue, and I believe, yes, still very much relevant in the 21st century, those women's colleges and women's universities. Yeah.
Yes, great point po. Here's a question from one of our viewers. Do you think Philippine education can follow Bryn Mawr education?
In what way? Like, can you expound on that?
I don't know. This one came from Ma'am Andre. Did this come from a question from one of our audience? You're muted po, Ma'am, I think.
Yes po. Bremer's education po, sabi niya, can we follow that kind of outlook of the Bremer's mission
Ah,
in education?
okay. Mm-hmm. So thank you very much for that question. So Bryn Mawr, right? So it's one of the women's colleges in the U.S. Really, one of the seven sisters. So do we have women's colleges in the Philippines that are? We have Saint Scholastica. We have Miriam, right? So
Yes.
we have those.
Mm.
Yeah, we have a number of those women's colleges. So I think what we see, right? What we see in those women's colleges in the Philippines, like Miriam College, for example, right, and Saint Scholastica, we see those institutions for women that produce women who are leaders in various fields, right, and even active in advocating for women's rights, for political rights, for national independence, and other issues that are important not just for women but for the Filipinos in general.
Now let's hit a little bit more closer to home here because we wanna look at the Filipinas naman ngayon. Filipina. Um, what Filipina characteristics can you associate with Suda's character?
Good question. So I think resilience, at saka yung resilience and flexibility, because especially if we think about the 21st century Pinay, or even not just the 21st century Pinay, right? So Filipinas they're everywhere. Not so, and in Philippines, typhoons, all those
Mhm.
natural calamities, as single women, as single mothers, as daughters, as sisters, right? And as workers, as unpaid workers, you really see women taking an active role in their families, in the larger communities, uh, in the Philippines, and also in various parts of the world. Women as workers in various fields, right? Um, for example, as healthcare providers, as domestic workers, right? In, in as nurses, yeah. So women as resilient, women as survivors, right?
Mhm.
Because that was really Tsuda, right?
Yeah.
And the how she adjusted to cultural differences
Hmm.
and many other challenges, right? Although she had the privilege of bringing, and she had opportunities that other women did not have, right? But those the fact the US back to Japan, right, and all those things. So women, I think Filipino, yeah, I think it's that resilience na makikita ko on Filipino women. What do you think, Andre? Would you
Yes.
agree?
Yes po. Kasi iba na yung mga babae ngayon, yung mga even though sa nakikita ko ma'am, um, yung workplace or education mismo ngayon kasi I'm teaching senior high school, makikita mo talaga na they are as you said, nung una lalaki lang sa STEM. Pero ngayon mas marami ng babae or maybe mas marami ng babae sa mga schools na tinuturuan ko. Mas
Right.
marami ng babae ngayon na sa STEM, sa science, mathematics, and engineering.
Right.
Sa technology, sa mga practical, sa technology na course, may mga babae na hindi lang, for example, bartending noon sa mga lalaki lang. Ngayon, meron ng babaeng bartender. At saka sa military, as history says, marami na ngayong mga babae na tinatanggap sa military schools.
And if I may add to that also, I think it's kasi merong perception noon that women are, they're hina, they're weak, that they cannot handle certain things, that konting hirap lang, they will susuko na yan. But what,
Unfortunately, sorry to interrupt. When you said, yeah, women mahina, I even heard
yeah,
one woman who said, I'm not going to vote for a female candidate for the presidency because mahina kasi babae. Yeah,
yeah,
unfortunately, you'll
yeah,
find that.
there are something, there are things like that. But what we see now is that I'm trying to find the malleability, the malleability on women, even Filipino women nowadays, that no matter how much you try them or beat them, it they what do you call this, they somehow manage to still cope up with the changes, and stay strong. That's something that I see characteristics of a Filipina, and something that I saw as a character that is in Suda.
Right.
That despite many challenges, she continued to pursue what she believes was right.
Right. So, and I agree with you, but I would also say that um, those characteristics should not be romanticized,
Mm-mm.
right? Because we also need to acknowledge yung mga yung mga structural right, yung mga bagay that limit women,
Oh, that's
that
true.
that,
Yeah.
that um prevent women from achieving their goals. So one of my
Mhm.
example was the case earlier of Tokyo University, those kinds of gendered, assumptions, norms, right, that
Mhm.
still ideals that still influence how institutions, right, those in power, um, approach, for example, admission in a medical school, right? So,
Mhm.
so we need to also acknowledge that, and raise awareness about those inequalities, those persisting elements of it, right, that prevent women from advancing or realizing their goals. So education is very, very important, and I'm glad that in the Philippines, right, many families, because they value the education of their children, right, because education is a vehicle for social mobility.
Mhm.
And so yeah, we have the education of so they provide for the education of their children, right? Yeah.
Very good point. There's Do we have a lot of we've learned a lot today, no, Ma'am Andre.
Yes po, as in,
This is
parang,
another a really great material that I would be, someday I would, if I would be teaching, like for example, college students on literature, or teaching them about culture. This is one of those materials or videos that I want to share with my
Mm,
students. Talaga, kasi
mm,
it's very important, I guess, that we see different sides of things,
yes.
not only in our own context as Filipinos, but
Right.
even in the different culture,
Yes.
because there are
yes,
shared experiences that we have
Yes.
with
Right.
other cultures that, though and I always say this in Kultura or in Kapua, that we cannot cut and paste certain um, we cannot cut and paste certain uh, policies or regulations from, like, for example, US to the Philippines.
Mm-hmm.
It would be, it's not advisable for me, not advisable that we do that, because we have different cultures and everything. But there are experiences that we can learn from, um, and I think that's very important, that we learn from those experiences, and then to help us kind of
You
like
learn
grow.
you learn from those connections, especially
Mhm.
forged
Yeah,
by women. Although through the story of Suda and these American women, we also learn that their stories about sisterhood,
mhm.
yung embedded in that, where yung mga racialized view of which women is superior, right, relative to the other women, and which country, right, um, is more advanced relative to others. So right, so this notion of transnationalism,
Mhm.
sisterhood among women from various cultures, countries, you can see the merits of using that. For example, through Suda School, right? She was able to generate a lot of yung mga donations from the US by using that. But we also see underneath that yung mga views about differences among women and nations, right? That underlay those kinds of connections. Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah,
Mhm.
and this is very important for me. This kind of discussion. I am surrounded by women.
Mhm.
I have a two older sister and my mom.
Mhm.
That that surrounds. I have two uh, young girls and my wife. So I'm really literally surrounded by women, and
So you
this
have two sisters,
two
older, did you
two
say?
older sisters.
Oh,
Yeah,
so you're the youngest.
and I'm the youngest, and I
Okay.
have two daughters,
Yeah.
five, you know, um, 5 and 6, that are, or 6 and 7, that are girls, and my wife. So I'm surrounded by women. I've always believed in really empowering women. Of course, I want my girls, my children, to have their own voice growing up, and this is very important, that we have something like this. But for me also, not to disregard that in the Philippines we do have that kind of like paternalistic culture still. And even with being a Christian, I believe that there should be a father figure, that or that paternalistic figure in the family still, because I always believe in that kind of like uh, not so many chef in the kitchen. There's
Mhm.
there should be one chef in the
Mhm.
kitchen.
Mhm.
Different roles in the house.
Mhm.
I
Mhm.
believe in
But the
that.
reality, and I'm sorry to insert this, but the reality right now for many families in the Philippines as elsewhere is those families need not just one, but like both husband and wife, right, as
Working together.
income earners,
Yes,
right?
income
And
earners. Yeah, yeah.
so giving your daughters, education, right?
Hmm.
Not privileging the education of sons, right? But educational opportunities is is in the long run very important.
Very
Kung
important.
ganyan, if you look
Yes,
at it from the perspective of the family, because
yeah,
that will make women more competitive, di ba?
yes.
When they
Okay.
apply for jobs,
Completely agree.
right? That is if you're going to look at it from the perspective of a family, looking at the contribution of women in the
Women.
domestic household economy. But as a feminist, Suda as a feminist, and I also believe this myself, that education and work is important. Paid work is important for women, for women's empowerment, so that they can decide for themselves and make decisions that are also good for themselves, right? There are
Yeah.
things that they can do if they are financially independent, if they can
Yes.
stand on their
Definitely.
own, in addition to the fact that they can contribute to their family. Diba?
Yes. Shout
Yes
out
po.
to my wife, who was who also works hard. My wife, who for the National Women's Month. Shout out
Right.
to all the women out there
So
po, to
all the
all of
women, the
you.
Happy,
mothers, the
happy
grandmothers.
Yes.
International Women's
Right,
Month.
right. And I think I saw the message of my cousin who is here in the US. She's originally from the Philippines, from UP. So Inday Lilian. She retired as a teacher in California and now in Texas. And I forgot her term. She looks after her grandchildren and she has a term for that. Like that's unpaid work by women who have already
Mm,
retired. So I
yeah.
don't know. She can message us about. She jokes about it. That's what she does now. And I have also a cousin in the Philippines who is also has retired from her work and takes care of her grandchildren for free. So again, another example of women's unpaid work. And we
Yeah.
can discuss about notions of work wherein we only think of work as work outside the home, and that's why women's work contribution within the family as mothers and wives are oftentimes not considered as
I don't
work.
work. No. Yeah.
But
Yeah.
That
Yeah.
has
yes,
to be, di ba?
Yeah.
kasi
We,
yun yung
we need to
unique
shed light on
in
that one. We need to
Philippines.
shed
And
light on that.
recognize those as women's contribution to the household economy.
Yeah.
That's work. That's why
Work still.
women should not just say, "Oh, I'm just a housewife." Like, what do
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
do, di
Yeah. Yeah.
ba? Some of them,
Mm-hmm.
Yes,
they say, "Oh, I'm just a
correct.
housewife." No, that is a what?
Yeah.
That's
That's
your
a full-time job.
hats
Yes,
off
And
to you.
sometimes with a lot of
24/7
overtime.
job.
Right.
With a
Yeah.
lot of overtime. Ano po.
Yes po, unpaid.
Shout
Unpaid.
out to my mom po,
Yes.
who's who's doing that, watching my kids.
Yes po,
24/7 work, di ba?
yes
Hmm.
po.
And let me link this to the reality, not just in the Philippines, but also in Japan, where right now, aging society, 20 to 25% of their population is 65 years and older. So that raises the question, who's going to take care of the elderly members of the family? And you know who? That's on the women, like
The daughter. Yeah.
daughters-in-law or
Yes,
unmarried daughter, di ba?
Hmm.
So
yes.
again, so they're like they take care of their husbands who are elderly, they take care of their
Kids.
grandchildren, right? So and but this also reminds me of the many women in the Philippines who take care of what? Their husband, they take care of their grandchildren. If their husbands are
Everybody.
working somewhere else, they're mothers and fathers at the same time, right?
Yeah.
Yes,
That's very true po.
definitely.
Oh my goodness. Great, Kwanpo. This is a perfect episode
For
for
Women's
International
For
Month.
Women's
March,
Month.
di ba?
Yes
Yes,
po.
yes, yes po. Thank you
Yeah.
so much. I
Thank,
know we could go on and still have a
yes,
lot to talk
yeah.
about. This really, I really appreciate conversations like this. I
Thank
will
you.
show hopefully my kids, my girls will someday watch this. And
Oh,
yeah, it'll
We,
make them a stronger woman. Yeah.
yeah. I teach history of women and gender in Asia here, aside from my other courses that I teach, classes that I teach. And I used Suda, her story, her letter,
Nice.
yeah.
that's the thing, Ma'am Febs, that I will share to my students about Suda,
Yes,
research on Suda and compare it to the Philippine setting,
yes.
so
Yes.
that
So feel free
uh
to email me if you want suggestions
yes,
for source materials on
yes,
Suda. Mhm.
definitely. And this conversation with you will be at our Facebook page for Kapwa or Kultura page for teachers reference po
Mhm.
on gender and
And
Yeah.
women's
by
Okay.
the way, Ma'am
And
Andrew,
speaking of teaching, right? So early 20th century, right? If political diplomatic history, US, Japan, that's a different picture. But when you look at it through women's history, through Tsuda and US women, that's a different kind of history there. Diba?
yes,
yeah.
Yeah.
yes,
Sorry, Sir Alan, for inserting
No,
myself.
no, that's okay po. I actually want to ask permission. Can we mention to them a little bit about your project so that we can kind of have them anticipate to look forward to your? Because I'm looking forward to that. I'm looking forward to
Yes,
your own project.
thank you. But before I do that, let me again thank salamat gid. Thank you very much to those who are watching right now, those who are from the US, friends, family members from various parts of the Asia Pacific region, maybe former students, colleagues, friends from the University of the
Yes,
Philippines in Miagao,
Renee
diba?
Transi is watching.
Ha?
Renee Transi is watching.
Oh, hello, Renee. Yeah, so those are so Alan, my former students in UP. Yeah.
Right.
So thank you very much for so I miss you all. I look forward to seeing you again, hopefully soon. And as Alan mentioned earlier, I'm currently working on another project, and this is about the Philippines. It's like going home, right? All the women's issues, that's also closest to my heart. But this one is about the Culion leprosarium in U.S. occupied Philippines. So the early decades of the 20th century, the early
Right.
1900s. So I'm working on a book project about that. It's about patient activism, the activism of those Filipinos who were forcibly brought to, somebody from Thailand. Thank you very
Yes.
much. So maybe that's a new one. My friend here in the US who is from Thailand originally. Thank you very much for joining us today. See, it is very much international. I told you,
Yes.
right? So maybe from Australia and also from the UAE.
We have
Yeah.
from Dubai po. We have somebody from Dubai also watching.
Hi, somebody from Dubai. So that's probably Glenn. Hi there. And those from Iloilo and other parts of the Philippines. Yeah, I don't know. Maybe from Singapore. Yeah. Do we have somebody from Singapore? No. Australia? No.
We have a while ago. I saw somebody po from Japan.
From
One of my
Japan.
friends, yeah, from one of my friends in Japan was here.
Yes,
Even the
wow.
one from Korea also. Really international po yung
I
We're
know.
international.
Yes,
from
because it's a
Washington.
topic that resonates
Yeah.
with people from other cultures, right? Yung
Mhm.
relevance niya, right? You don't have to be somebody from those countries in order to appreciate the story of those
Mhm.
connections made by women, right?
Yeah.
So yes, my Culion book, I'm working on it, and as soon as it is out, I'm going to, yes, I'll reach out to Andre and Sir Alan here, and hopefully, have another chance to share my work with you in this
Yes.
time.
We
Yes,
can. We look forward to it
definitely
po.
po.
Yeah.
We're
Looking forward to that.
looking
Public
forward.
health, right? Especially many similarities with COVID, with our experience during this COVID-19 pandemic. Yeah. So,
Yes.
yeah.
Yes. Thank you
Okay.
po. Thank you so much, Ma'am Andre. Thank
Yes,
you for
Ma'am
this great
Feby.
event.
Yes, thank you po, Ma'am Feby, for
Ma'am
accepting the
Febe, thank you.
invitation and for future invitations with Kultura po or with Kapwa. Before we end this segment, for those teachers or for those Kumu members or Kultura community members who are looking forward for the Kultura code for today's event, you can visit us at www.riverboystudios wixsite.com. Go to our events and go to the survey form and so that you will receive your certificate. And for the Kultura code, watch out for Kumo on our Kumo page. And for next time, we will have Cecilia Brainard, another Filipino writer, for March 20 for her talk about women also, the wild women in her novel. That's
Wow.
all for now here in Iloilo, Ma'am Febs. So thank you
Right.
so much mga kakultura, Ma'am Feby and Sir Alan. Salamat po, kapwa.
Yes. And just a final word also for those teachers who are waiting for our programs for the Kapua Academy. Me and Ma'am Andre actually is working on applying for applying for our
Renewal.
programs with PRC, so that you're gonna get accredited, or you get units, you get credits for your the renewal of your license po. Uh,
Mm.
it's gonna be out soon. We're just working on applying right now. I just don't have time, pero me and Ma'am Andre will work on that to
Yes
for
po.
those programs to be applied for PRC po. Thank you
Wow,
so
Thank you so much.
wonderful. Yeah.
Baby, thank
Yes
you
po.
so much. For we can't wait for your next guesting here in
Yes po. I'll
KULECTERATURA
send
again.
you a message in Messenger, Ma'am Febs. I hope you'll have your Facebook now or Messenger because Ma'am Febs don't have Facebook.
Yeah, because I don't have Facebook. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yes.
So thank you
Good night
again to
po.
everyone.
Thank you
Thank you
so
for the
much.
invitation. Thank you to the people in Iloilo in the Philippines and in other parts of the world who are watching right now. Thank you for your time.
We'll
Thank
send
you.
you your certificate po, ma'am. We'll send
Sige.
it. Thank you,
You're the
thank you
Bye.
best.
po. Bye bye.
Bye.